Well, welcome and thank you for watching. This is the London System versus Zara 850 Game 2. And then right below is the template that we've been using for the London setup as our guide. So let's begin. D4, B5, bishop to F4, pawn to D5, knight to F3, and then pawn to E6. Now, with the move of the pawn to E6, I want you to note that it has opened up this diagonal for the dark square bishop to attack the king, as well as this dark square diagonal for the queen to come to H4 and attack the king along that line. Now, we've already seen in previous videos how to deal with these threats. If you're uncertain about how to do that, please refer to the previous videos, because what we're doing is we're adding our repertoire of tactics, both defensively and offensively, utilizing the London so that we know how to deal with the threats, especially as we move on up the chess.com bot rating ladder and these threats get more and more complex. So we're kind of learning the simple defensive and offensive maneuvers, and these will begin to get more and more complex as we learn more and more. And hopefully with each video, we're adding to our repertoire of knowledge concerning the utilization of the London system, both offensively and defensively. So we'll move E3. Zara responds with C6. The B knight to D2, bishop to D7, and C3, one of the typical moves again in the London, a knight to A6, and let me go back, because I chose to move this pawn to A3 because there's something that I saw happening that I wanted to lend more support to the B4 square, and it is this. Our opponent has eyes on this with the dark square bishop. The queen could come to A5, have eyes on this, and then we also have this knight here being able to utilize pressure on the B4 square. And at the time, before this move, all I had really was this one pawn to potentially defend. And so I thought it would be wise, at least at this point in this stage in my learning, to bring up another pawn to A3 and provide a little bit more support to defend the B4 square. Final move of the London setup with the bishop to D3. And once again, when we get to this stage of having our setup with the London, it's always good just to review the lines of attack, the potential opportunities that are before us. So a couple of these that we can see very quickly is if we wanted to castle, we can do that now. We've talked about the knight at F3 moving to the E5 square, which is very strategic. We've talked about the lines for attack for both of our bishops along the light square diagonals as well as the dark square diagonals. And then as well, we have the queen along the light square diagonals and the attacking lines there. So again, just an opportunity to review these and maybe look for possible scenarios as we continue through this game. Zara chooses to advance the H-pawn to H5. I'm going to take the opportunity right now, because there's kind of a lull in the action with some of these pawn moves, to go ahead and move my H-pawn up to H3. We've talked about the safety valve for the bishop in case we need to move it to a protective square. So it's always good to kind of have this in our repertoire of moves. It also will provide, if we choose to castle, it'll provide an escape hatch for our king from the back row should that be needed. Zara responds by moving the queen over to C8. And with that, we might note that in past games, this C file has been very instrumental in being able to utilize it for potential attacks upon our opponent. We'll kind of keep that in mind as we go along. So let's go ahead and move our knight to the E5 square, and you may be looking at this scenario and go, well, it can be repelled very easily with this pawn move to f6. But if you actually do move the pawn there, what we could do is then move our knight here, targeting both the bishop and the rook, and be in a very strategic position without threat. So you certainly, before moving a piece like this to the e5 square, you want to consider the potential, and I did, and I saw this opportunity, should it avail, that I would be able to take advantage of. Many times in our moves, it's not the next move that we really need to be concerned about that we're about to make. It's the move after that. Where will we go afterwards, or what is going to be the follow-up move? So you kind of want to expand your knowledge and understanding when you look at the chessboard of, okay, I'm going to make this move, but then what would be my follow-up move, depending on what the opponent might do. Now, certainly one of the great tools that IMs and GMs have is they can visualize 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 moves on down the line from the move that they're about to make, and picture it all on the chessboard. I'm not there. You're probably not there as well, but just expanding one more move, the move we're about to make, and then the next follow-up move. We need to begin to think about that along our lines as we continue on in our chess development. So Zara responds with bishop to e7. And now at this point, we're going to bring our rook over and begin to see if we can't solidify this C file and begin to take control of it. Zara responds by moving the knight back to b8. And let me take this back. As I look at this setup, there's not a whole lot of other movement that we can make with some of the major pieces. Certainly we could go ahead and castle if we wanted to. I'm not quite ready to do that. But what I've learned is when you're kind of at a loss of maybe moving minor pieces or coming up with some strategy, start pushing your pawns forward. Start utilizing these pawns as a means of breaking through the defenses of your opponent, or at least putting them in a position where they can be utilized later on in the game to break through defenses. And that's what I did when I was looking at the queen side of the board here. I thought, well, I don't really have any other good options of moves of minor pieces. I'll just start pushing some of these pawns. And it's interesting that Zara kind of responds in like manner, beginning to push the g pawn to g6. So now we're looking at a possible scenario here of moving the c pawn up and engaging this structure and beginning to try and break through. So we move to c4, and we'll wait to see what Zara responds, because we have the protection from the b pawn as well as from the bishop and this knight and this knight. So we have a lot of firepower to be able to focus in and defend the c4 square, and we're going to utilize that right now to try and break through some of these defenses. Zara responds with pushing the h pawn to h4. So now I'm looking at this structure with these pawns, and I really have a choice here to take to the b file or to the d file. And I notice that if I take to the d file, I'm really moving into the strength of this setup and the other supporting pieces here. And what I've learned in playing is one of the best ways to break through a pawn structure like this is to go to the edge and begin to try and break down the edge. And that's what I did in this by taking the b5 square. And what you're going to notice here is something very interesting that happens, and that is that Zara cannot retake with the c6 pawn, because then that would open up the attack upon the queen with the rook. So we're in a very advantageous place by kind of nibbling on the edges of this structure and beginning to utilize some more control over the c file. Zara responds with knight to h6. And we're just going to continue to take because we have the protection of the rook as well as the knight here to engage any of the forces of our opponent. And Zara makes a huge blunder, and I'll show you why in just a moment. This is moving the bishop here to the D6 square is not the blunder. The blunder is not taking care of this threat. So I'm going to go ahead and take the bishop with this pawn, and by doing so, I place the king in check and have also threatened the queen, and I have opened up the full file for my rook to attack the queen. But the king is in check, and that is what our opponent must deal with. Now you say the queen could just come up and take the pawn, both evading the attack by the rook as well as alleviating this check upon the king, but my knight is right here to be able to take the queen. So this is a very difficult position for Zara to be in. She responds with the knight taking the pawn at d7, and now I am free to go ahead and move down with the rook and take the queen. Zara responds with the rook taking my rook at c8. So having kind of had a flurry of activity, what we want to do now is kind of back off from the chessboard and look at where we're at, possible scenarios of both offensive and defensive lines. And as I looked at this, I thought that the best move that I could make right now would be to get my king to safety, have access to this rook, and be able to possibly utilize it in the further attack upon our opponent's king. So that is what I did. Zara responded with rook to h7. And now I would like to bring my queen into play here and begin to utilize this. Certainly I can't go along the c file for the attack upon it by the rook, but if I could just go ahead and simply move the b pawn up to b4 and open up this diagonal, certainly would present an opportune move to begin to put more pressure upon our opponent. That's what I did. Zara responds by moving the bishop back to e7, and I bring the queen out to a4, pinning the knight to the king. So Zara responds by moving the rook to c7, giving support and protection here to the knight. So as I was able to review this game, I now can see some potential attacking lines that I actually didn't see at the time of my learning. And maybe you could see those as well. If we take this knight and go ahead and take the knight at d7, more than likely the rook would take in response to that. We could then move our light squared bishop to b5, putting pressure upon the rook and pinning the rook to the king. Good scenarios, all of those. I didn't happen to see them at the time. I kind of started thinking about this structure and how we might be able to attack it. And so I moved my e-pawn up to e4 to begin to kind of engage this structure. Certainly not the best move, but we learn as we go along. And Zara responds by moving the knight back to g8. So I'll take this pawn at d5. Zara responds by moving the bishop to d6, threatening both the bishop, the knight and the bishop. So I will just simply take the pawn at e6, and now Zara responds by taking the pawn. And once again, I have this same scenario before me that we had before. I could easily just take the knight with my knight at e5. The rook would respond by taking it, bring my bishop here, pin the rook to the king. Again, I didn't quite see that, so I push my b pawn forward to b5. Zara responds by moving the rook back to h8. And now I can move my queen to a6 and further my development at this point as I'm trying to surround the king and kind of corral it in. Zara responds with taking my knight at e5, and I'm going to respond by taking with the pawn and putting pressure upon the dark square bishop. Zara moves down the rook to c2, and of course this is kind of just a sacrifice because I can easily take with the light square bishop, which I do. Zara responds by moving the dark square bishop to c5. And now I have a move with the queen that could be very advantageous of moving to the c6 square, putting the king in check and also threatening an unguarded piece here. And so that is what I do. Check to the king. The bishop is unguarded. The king moves to d8. So I'll just go ahead and take the bishop. Zara responds by bringing the knight over to e7 in order to begin to lend support for defense. I'll just go down here and take this unguarded pawn at a7. And Zara responds by bringing the knight up to threaten the bishop at f4. But hopefully you see what I see, in that I can easily get out of that threat, move to g5 and put the king into check, which is what I did. Zara responds by moving the king to e8. Now, before you look at this scenario and go, oh, well, this is easy, I'll just move the queen to e7, checkmate. Don't forget that knights can move backwards. How do I know this? Experience. Believe me, I've fallen prey to that and hung a queen out there to be taken, forgetting that pieces actually can move backwards. So don't make that mistake. Learn from my mistakes. So I'm going to move the light square bishop to b3, putting pressure upon the knight. And Zara responds by moving the rook up to h5, putting pressure upon the bishop. I can easily defend that with the f-pawn moving to f4. And Zara responds by moving the knight to c7, which again is nothing more than a delay tactic toward the imminent checkmate that is coming. I'll take with the queen. The rook moves to threaten the queen. That is not a threat. I'll just come over and take the rook. And now certainly we're in full control of the chessboard. And so I'm going to begin to look at potential moves here, because we're noticing, and you need to be aware of this, these pawns have no movement. They cannot go anywhere. So all of the movement from here on out, unless a position changes, is going to be predicated upon the king. In this case, the king moves to f7 or f8. And I need to be careful at this point to not allow in my movements for the king to get in a stalemate position, which simply means I have all the surrounding squares of the king potentially placed in check, and the king doesn't have anywhere to move other than to place itself in check, which is stalemate, the very definition of stalemate. And that is because, once again, there aren't any alternative moves that black can make. It's all upon the king. So I need to be very precise in my movements, that I don't bring all of this effort in this game to get to this point of superiority and begin to just make a few moves to checkmate the king, that I don't inadvertently allow a stalemate to happen. How do I know that can occur? Once again, experience. I've done it several times. So looking at the board, I see a safe move is to bring the light squared bishop to capture the pawn at e6. And note that the squares that the king cannot move are these, but I have left one square open here at e8. The king can move there. And now I just have a simple one move mate with the queen at e7 being protected by the dark square bishop. So once again, wonderful game, lots to learn here. I encourage you to review this game as well as continue to play your own games with the London system, gain in your understanding of both the offensive and defensive lines of the London system. And we're going to progress on to the next chess.com bot and hopefully learn even more as we progress. So thank you again for watching. Look forward to seeing you in the next video.